Hello and welcome to another episode of A Rough Sketch of History, the Meuse-Argonne Offensive, Phase 3, the final phase of the battle. So we finally made it to this point, and this is our last rough sketch map. As I've done before, I'll kind of just go over the brief points on this map. Here is the American line on October 31st, how far they had advanced. The Argonne Forest is here. Oh, I left it off, but I mean, the Seine River flows along the border of the Argonne Forest. The village of Vermange and Crenelle, the heights at Baroncourt, and the ridge line there, Mount Foucault, and the Meuse River with Sedan up at the top. Just a quick recap up to this point, that the American objective was to reach Sedan and then up to Messines to take the rail lines to cut off the German supplies to a large section of the front. It was a major operation, hoping to bring an end to the war. The Argonne Forest is a dense and hilly forest. All of this area is pocketed with woods, heavy ridges and hills. But once you get up past the heights at Baroncourt and the ridge here, it comes down into plains, and this is all flat. And that was the goal, was to get past all the German defenses that were in through here and out into open country. We've been through all the ups and downs of how they did or didn't progress. But one thing to keep in mind is that, so the Americans started their advance roughly at the bottom of the map here. And as the crow flies, it's about 35-40 miles to Sedan. Not very far. And the Americans have probably only advanced anywhere from 10 to 15 miles. And you have to consider, again, this is October 31st, and the Americans have been in heavy fighting since September 26th, so more than a month to move 10 to 15 miles. You have to get a sense of the pace of how stiff the German resistance was. As we've talked about, the battle was broken up into 3 phases, and this is the third and final phase of the battle. So even though this is the line of October 31st, let's go back in time a little bit and see what brought us to this point as phase 2 and 3 kind of blend together. So as of October 18th, the Germans were on the run, and it looked like the American Expeditionary Force had managed to turn things around. But what happens next? Nothing. The American Expeditionary Force is a different army, both in leadership and in practice, than the day the battle started, September 26th. And the advance and attack at all cost mentality is now gone. A period of rest and reorganization is called for. In the history books, halting armies is rarely praised as strategic genius. But just as Pershing stepping down was for the best for the American Expeditionary Force, the American Expeditionary Force had come to learn its limits, which is as important as knowing its strengths, which it had also come to learn. Excuse me. At this point, there were about 1 million doughboys in the Meuse-Argonne, and about 10% of them, the army had no idea where they were. As I stated in the prior video, as I discussed the nature of the Meuse-Argonne Offensive, this battle put a great mental and physical toll on the doughboys. Prior attempts to keep the men fighting at an inhuman pace had been ineffectual. Orders were given to shoot deserters. Whole units of military police were assigned to comb the forest for the Americans, comb the forest looking for Americans hiding in abandoned German bunkers, trying to wait out the battle. Captured deserters were sometimes humiliated in front of their comrades, forced to wear placards around their necks labeling them as cowards. But as of October 18th, there was a new sheriff in town, so to speak. General Hunter Liggett reversed these policies. He called for the army to halt. He argued that many of the men who had deserted the front lines had done so because they had been without food or sleep for several days. All they needed was to find their way back to the field kitchens, get some food, get some sleep, and they would return to their units. And I'd like to go over this again. As I said, about 10% of the army was missing, not missing in action, but absent without leave, so to speak, strewn all over this area. And you got to think about this. That's 100,000 men just wandering, lost, hiding. Hunter Liggett's strategy here of, again, recouping the strength of these men was important, and also how he did it, like as I said, was he simply let them come back on their own, and for the most part they did. And he was correct that most deserters worked their way back to their units, or were simply brought back with little fanfare to prevent morale issues. Punitive actions were rarely taken, or were tried to kept light. Though the fighting never really stopped, it settled down, and the doughboys had from October 18th to October 31st to rest and recuperate. The Germans were in no position to counterattack. And to top all of this off, word was that there was a ceasefire agreement in the works. The long-awaited day was coming, and it looked like the war might end soon. As I've said before, in the 4 years between 1914 and 1918, First World War armies changed from Napoleonic armies to modern ones. You could say that from September 26th to October 18th of 1918, the American army changed from a Civil War army to a modern army. But it was a painful learning process. When the French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau was informed by leaders in the French military that the American army had refused offers of French instructors in training of modern warfare tactics, he was reported to have said something to the effect of, "If the Americans won't learn from the French, then the Germans will teach them." And the mass infantry assaults, and teach them the Germans did. The mass infantry assaults were abandoned in favor of small unit tactics that had been adopted by both the Allies, the French and British, and the Central Powers, the Germans and Austrians. The U.S. Army took on a character that it still has today, that had become a firepower army. The Meuse-Argonne was the birthplace of the modern U.S. military doctrine, the broad strokes of which are that firepower wins wars, and firepower cannot be maintained without proper supplies and logistics. It was accepted that the pre-war doctrine of focusing on individual skills, such as marksmanship and bravery, cannot overcome the firepower of industrialized warfare. It was determined that to defeat an enemy, opposing firepower, that firepower had to be matched and preferably exceeded. Only then could bravery and skill lead to success. This was not the only change on the ground that the U.S. Army underwent, it was not only on the ground that the U.S. Army underwent changes, but also in the air. The U.S. Army Air Service had had little direct impact on the Meuse-Argonne up to this point. The U.S. Army Air Service doctrine had been that fighters and bombers should take the fight to the enemy deep behind enemy lines, destroying communications and transportation, which would hinder frontline forces in an indirect manner. The idea was that the pressure would cause the German fighters and bombers to be so focused on defending German positions that they would be unable to attack the doughboys on the ground. In fact, the doughboys were told that there would be no German planes to worry about. And I've done a brief sketch here. So imagine here we have American infantry forces, German infantry forces, and here we have German airfields rail lines, supply depots, and roads. It had been the focus of the American Army to attack the airfields, to attack the rail lines, the depots, cutting off the supplies from the German army. This is a type of military tactic often referred to as interdiction. But you have to consider that airplanes were still in their infancy during the First World War, though they had changed immensely in a short number of years. They did not have the same type of capabilities that modern planes would have, or even planes in the Second World War. And this was simply a task that was beyond them. The technology and the doctrine didn't, and the strategies and tactics didn't really allow for this to be an effective use. It's an interesting kind of side note. I noticed that there was a lot of, at the 50-year mark after the First World War, there was a lot of interviews and recordings of veterans. And one of the things that came up over and over again and comes up in these interviews, and that several books that I've read mentioned, was that even after all that time, many of the doughboys expressed extreme anger at the American Air Service because, again, they had been told coming to the battle there would be no German planes. And that was not the case, and all those years later, they still held on to the anger and frustration. They felt they had been lied to and that the Air Service had let them down. But there had been a dramatic shift coming after this point because the prior tactics had not been effective. As I said before, First World War planes could do relatively little damage to the ground, but the effect on morale was considerable. As I said before, the doughboys had been assured that they would not be bombed or strafed by enemy planes, though they were able to essentially strike the ground forces with impunity with no defenses from the American fighters. Now, the effectiveness of attacking the back lines as opposed to the front lines is somewhat debatable. In the Meuse-Argonne, after the war, there were analysis done, and the results were mixed, and there were disagreements at that time, and it's never really been a settled. It's never really been a settled point, as it's hard to qualify the indirect effects. But at the beginning of the third phase, it was decided that the direct consequences of having American planes, not having American planes over the front, outweighed the benefits of the indirect benefits of hampering the Germans behind the lines. So when the offensive resumed, the American Air Service patrolled over the doughboys and fought German pilots in the skies over the doughboys who fought German soldiers below. There was still the danger of the Air Service, or the German Air Force, but it would not be the scourge that it was during the first two phases of the battle, as all of the efforts were concentrated directly on the front. The last major change of the U.S. Army during this period of rest and reorganization was the decision to massively increase the use of chemical weapons shells by the American military. At the start of the battle, it was hoped that if the U.S. didn't use gas warfare, the Germans wouldn't either, as the Americans felt that it was more trouble than it was worth, and they assumed that the Germans would tacitly agree, preferring to fight without it. The Americans soon realized that the Germans would not limit their use of gas weapons whatsoever, and began to retaliate with their own chemical weapons. But it was not until Phase 3 of the battle that the Americans had the gas shells in sufficient quantities for it to have a major effect. For the remainder of the war, the American Expeditionary Force would expend a huge amount of gas shells, particularly the use of mustard gas and similar blistering agents, as we've discussed before. So in preparations for Phase 3, the American Expeditionary Force is taking on, preparations were being made for Phase 3, the American Expeditionary Force had taken the last of the Germans' heavily prepared positions. What was left, the Germans were left with to defend were hastily dug trenches, no longer in forested hills, but in open countries, but along an open ridgeline. which is across the forest on this ridge here in front of the heights of Barencourt. This was not the Hindenburg line that we've discussed before, but a simple connection of trenches, hastily dug foxholes, and to makeshift defenses. So as October 31st came to an end, the offense began again. November 1st hits, and early in the morning, the American Expeditionary Force opens up with a bombardment of artillery almost as large as the opening bombardment that kicked off the battle on September 26th. We focused on the American perspective for most of these videos, but let's look at what's happening now from the Germans' perspective. You've been fighting for months, maybe years. You have been through all the same terrible things that the doughboys faced in the Meuse-Argonnes. Rumors have been swirling around for days that a ceasefire is in the works and the war will be over soon. You were told to defend shallow, simple trenches in open fields when for weeks you've been fighting from complex constructed defenses and defenses constructed of concrete and timber along the tops of hills and ridgelines. Suddenly you've come under some of the worst artillery bombardments you've experienced during the whole war. It lets up and you see masses of American soldiers advancing towards you. What do? Some surrendered, most ran. The German army was shattered. It continued to offer isolated pockets of resistance, but the German army was in full flight, and no doubt it had intended to retreat back to the Meuse, where it could put up a defense there. But without a doubt, the German army did not have the stomach for a pitched battle in the open fields of France. Within a matter of a few days, by November 3rd, the Americans had advanced past the German defenses to this point. Now, it's worth noting that in the Americans in their after-action reports and analysis of the battle afterwards noted that from the start of the battle, the Americans had been facing a shaky German army that was already deeply weakened by the extent of the war, and that perhaps the German army of 1915, 16, or 17 might have been able to mount some sort of counterattack or makeshift resistance at this point, but that army was gone. The elite men and highly trained officers of the German army were predominantly killed or wounded, and though what was left was a tough and determined fighting force, it was a shadow of what it had been. The American Expeditionary Force now advanced rapidly with steady progress. It looked as if the battle and the war would soon end, but not without tragic mistakes before it was all over. With the war soon coming to an end, Pershing issued an order. Though he had stepped down as direct commander, he did intervene in this moment and ordered an all-out race for Sedan. Up here. Ordering that all units move to capture it as soon as they could, wanting to take it before the war ended. He even permitted the prior sacrosanct divisional lanes to be ignored. These were the orders that divisions were given to stay within certain geographical boundaries during a fight. So I've illustrated that here. It's a pretty simple concept. You have the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th division, and on a map they would have lines. They could move around within these units, but they weren't to cross. And that's how they could keep from getting in others' way and preventing issues of friendly fire. But with Sedan up here, if you imagine their target here, all of a sudden these divisions are crossing over. Now in a modern, or at least in today, or even in the time of World War II, this wouldn't have been that big of an issue. But as we recalled from Phase 1, that strict adherence to these lanes had cost the the American Expeditionary Force dearly because of a lack of flexibility. But there is value in the system. As American units started to bump into each other, in the frantic scramble to get to Sedan first, chaos ensued. You have to remember that this is before portable radios. Again, like as I've mentioned in previous videos, that pigeons were often used to communicate long distances. And since these units were on the move now, they could no longer rely on any type of telephone contact, which relied on wires being drawn out. In this chaos, at best, the same units wanted to march down the same roads at the same time. And whole companies of doughboys got in fistfights with each other over who could move first. At worst, American units were misidentified as German, and fierce firefights broke out between American units, with several often resulting in many casualties before they realized that they were on the same side. Why risk for such chaos to capture Sedan when the war was clearly going to end any day? It is certain that Pershing's pride pushed him to try to take Sedan before the war ended. After all, that was the whole purpose of the offensive. The strategic and historical significance of Sedan, both to the Germans and to the French, as we discussed in earlier videos, meant that holding Sedan when the shooting stopped would be a great bargaining chip for President Wilson in the post-war negotiations. And Pershing wanted to give Wilson that chip. Excuse me. In the end, it came to nothing. The American Expeditionary Force was never able to cross the Meuse in significant numbers before the ceasefire ended. By November 11th, American forces were moving essentially unopposed right up to the line of the Meuse River. And again, you can give a sense of what this means, that for the first month of the battle, only about this distance was crossed, only about a third of what was necessary. The last third was done in less than 2 weeks. But as the war was ending, the tragedy was not ending. As the November 11th came, the 11th day of the 11th month, and at the 11th hour, 11 a.m., the war stopped. The ceasefire had taken effect, which had been agreed to. But as I said before, this was a time before portable radios and reliable communications. The information did not reach some outlying American units in time, particularly units of the U.S. Marine Corps, which were trying to cross the river, even though the Germans were actually aware of the ceasefire and were trying to signal to the Americans to stop shooting. The U.S. Marines took it as a trick, and fighting continued. Both Americans and Germans would continue to fight and die until late in that afternoon, when the whole front went quiet, as word was finally confirmed that the ceasefire was in effect. And with that, the Meuse-Argonne Offensive and the war was over. One thing that I've read over and over from many doughboy accounts was the shock of the silence. For weeks they had been surrounded with the crack of rifle fire, chattering of machine guns, artillery rumbling in the distance when it was not landing and blasting nearby. And then all of a sudden, all along the front, that stopped. And the silence, they said, hurt their ears. They began ringing incessantly. You know, the sound you get when you can hear silence. Many accounts describe this as physically painful, as they had grown accustomed to the cacophony. With the fighting over, Germans and Americans met each other for the first time, not as adversaries. Again, I want to stress that there had been fighting going along all the banks of the river and along the eastern bank of the Meuse up till the 11th hour. And literally at the second, it stopped. So the Americans and Germans were often yards, only a matter of yards from each other, enough that they could shout and hear each other's voices. And then the war stopped. Many doughboys talked about the Germans being much less reserved about making contact than they had been. The Germans cautiously approached the Americans at first, and then with enthusiasm when it became clear that it was safe to do so. Many of them wanted to sell things or trade with the Americans, who had lots of food. The Germans, both on the front lines and at home, were on the verge of starvation. German helmets and pistols. Doughboys were particularly fond of Lugers as souvenirs, Luger pistols, were traded for food and cigarettes. I came across accounts describing the strangeness of it all, as prior to this, most doughboys had felt a deep hatred towards the Germans, assuming that they were some of the most evil people that the world had ever seen. And after weeks of fighting each other, both the Americans and the Germans were able to see each other not as enemy soldiers, but as people, and people who simply wanted to go home. But the war would change what home they went to. The First World War transformed America into an economic powerhouse, and an economy which would boom well into the roaring 20s. Germany would collapse both economically and politically. Soldiers on both sides would go home to a very different place. The First World War would not be the last war as it was hoped, but the first industrial war, and the Meuse-Argonne Offensive would be all but forgotten in America's collective memory. Forgotten but not meaningless. The First World War laid the foundation for America as a superpower. Lessons of the Meuse-Argonne will become the foundations of the modern American military. The Meuse-Argonne was a pivotal moment in U.S. history. We live in the world that it created, and it makes it worthy of our study today. Thank you for taking the time to listen to these videos. I hope they were interesting and informative. I hope that they will encourage you to want to learn more about history, and particularly the First World War. Thank you with that, and that closes the third phase. And again, I felt like it's kind of moved quickly, but the last phase, that's exactly what happened. Essentially, the battle ended with the Americans chasing the Germans for about 2 weeks, nearly as fast as they could run, and as I said, in a moment, a switch was flipped and the war was over. And with that, this video series is over as well. So again, I thank you, and I think I will do one more short video, an epilogue, so to speak, sort of give my thoughts. I know I've interjected and rambled here at times. It's probably pretty clear when I'm reading a script and when I'm improvising, but again, I thank you for your time, and join me in the epilogue for the last video.